Normandy 44, a game that came out a couple of years ago, designed by very well respected wargame designer Mark Simonich, came out a couple of years ago, and then more recently last year a new second edition came out. Now, I haven't played the first edition, so I cannot compare. This is simply going to be a review of the second edition, so I'm going to talk about gameplay in general, components, rules, etc, etc, but I'm not going to be able to compare. So if you have the first edition and you're wondering, is the second one worth taking, you'll have to look for information about that somewhere else, or simply maybe by watching this video you're able to extrapolate and figure out the differences. Normandy 44, about, of course, the most wargamed, or one of the most wargamed topics in the history of wargaming. So we are towards the end of World War II. We are in Europe. One side will play the Germans trying to hold on to northern France, and the other side will play the Allies. The Allied side is split into two groups, the Americans and the Commonwealth, which means also that this game is one of the not very many war games that can be played effectively by 3 players by simply giving control of one side to the Germans and then the two sides that form the Allied forces to 2 different players. In any case, the players, the two sides of the Allies cannot work together too much. They have to work in different areas of the map. When it comes to the northern area, they are separated geographically. Then later they can mingle a bit more. But in any case, there is a logistic difference between the two sides that makes also the game playable by 3 players. Let me show you how the game works. Here you have a general view of the map. It is printed on paper, so you may want to place it under a piece of plexiglass. It is a single map, and the size of the map is, well, just about right. It is not so small that this will be a simply introductory game, a super simple game like some by Paul Koenig with the same topic that we have here, Normandy 44. At the same time, it's not a monster game like Battle for Normandy. Just about right, and it looks good and is functional like most of GMT maps. As you can imagine, in the game, the Allies will come from those areas there, they will land, they will fight to establish beachheads, and then they will start advancing towards the interior. There will be German units here taking a little bit aback at the beginning, with reinforcements coming from various sides of the map. And the Allies will need to cordon off this area to protect their beachheads, and also they will need to move towards that area to clear the peninsula, take control of Cherbourg there, and then try to expand as much as possible and to solidify their presence on the continent. The units in the game are represented by counters such as these ones. Most have 2 main values on them, combat factor and movement factor respectively. They may also have a number here on the side that represents troop quality. Armor units also have a number in between firepower and movement, which represents armor quality. And then we have other things such as headquarters that can act as conduits for artillery support. We have air units, and we have cadres. Some units have 3 steps, so once they take a hit, they are flipped to the reduced side, and when they take another hit, they're physically removed from the board, but not from the game, because they're replaced by a generic cadre unit on the board. Later, if the cadre unit receives reinforcements, receives replacements, it can be replaced with the original unit. At the beginning of each turn, the first thing that you need to do is to determine the weather, so you roll on a table. And, of course, overcast and clear skies are good for the Allied player as they simulate air superiority, so they slow down movement of the Germans. And storm weather is bad for the Allies because, of course, they have problems in bringing supplies to the continent. After you determine the weather, you may have to resolve mulberry construction, which increases the capacity of the Allied beachheads, and then both players will receive supply points that are recorded on this general track. The general track helps you to keep record of a lot of shifting values and resources that you acquire and spend during the game. So players will receive supply points, they also receive replacements, and then Once that has been recorded, the turn can start with first a German player turn, which is later followed by an LA player turn. When both players are done, the overall general turn is over. Now, at the beginning of his player turn, the German player can use replacements on any units that are able to receive replacements, and then the German player can move any and all of his units. Movement is pretty much traditional, as you can expect. It is based on the movement points that the player has as affected by terrain, such as roads, and of course you have a lot of bocage, flooded access, marsh. This is Normandy after all. Also, as I said, weather may affect movement too. Something else that affects movement is both zones of control and bonds. This is the former concept you probably are familiar with. Zones of control are projected by units in the 6-axis surrounding them, unless there are some external factors such as terrain that can block them, and units need to stop when they enter an enemy zone of control. Also, it costs an extra movement point to leave a zone of control, but it doesn't cost any extra to enter a zone of control. However, as it happens in some of the designs by Simonich, enemy units also project a bond, which happens when two units are separated by a single hex, when there is an empty hex. In case the connecting element feature on the map between the two axes is a hex side, like you have here, imagine this axis connecting the two hexes, then the bond is on the hex side. If there is a full hex that separates the two enemy units, then the bond occupies the entire hex in between them. You cannot enter an hex that is in an enemy bond or cross a hex side that is in an enemy bond. So that allows the defender to construct the strong lines of defenses that you have to remove, that you have to assault, punch holes through before you can move through them. So that's something that the German player will want to exploit as much as possible to slow down the advance of the Allies, as the German player is doing their best to bring in reinforcements at a steady rate. After the movement phase of the active player, in this case the German, you have a combat phase, and we'll talk about that later. After that, you have reserve movement. That is, during the previous movement phase, the German player was given the option also of putting some units in reserve. There are reserve markers, you put them on units that you are keeping in reserve, and then you will activate them for movement, so basically a second round of movement, and combat, potentially a second round of combat, after you resolve the first and the last. That is, at the beginning you place some units in reserve, then you move all the other ones, you fight with the other ones, and then you get to move and fight with the reserve. It's a very interesting way of giving you some nuance and preventing some unrealistic results from happening, as a lot of you people will get stuck between actions, and why not give you the possibility of pacing your actions and seeing what happens with some of your units before you commit the other ones. I really like the option of putting units in reserve. I like it in most games, and I think it works well here. Then, after that, you have to check for supplies. That is pretty important, of course. You need to be supplied. The German player traces supplies through the southern and the eastern edge of the map, and the Allied player traces supply to the beachheads. And if you are not in supply, then of course there are several negative effects that will happen. There are several levels of being out of supply with progressively bad effects happening. But overall, it is a fairly standard turn structure. As you can see, we have an administrative phase at the beginning with weather and replacements and so on and so forth. Then the German player assigns replacements, movement, combat, reserve movement, reserve combat, check for supplies, and then you have the LA player turn, in which the LA player goes through the same procedure. Of course, there are a couple of unique things. For example, the LA player can also build mulberries, but overall, this is how it works. It is, again, pretty straightforward procedure. And since we're talking about movement, an important feature on the map is this line here, which divides the British and American areas of operation. So You need to make sure that you don't get too close to your allies because you like them, but kind of like love at a distance. You don't want to get in the way of what your friends are doing. Combat, we all love to know about how that works. Combat is voluntary and it is always against a single hex for each combat, but you can have people from various hexes working together towards a single objective. So you may attack from up to 6 hexes into an enemy hex. And however, if you are attacking with multiple units, as probably you will be in most of the cases, you will need to design one of the attacking groups as the main assault force. The main assault force gets to use all of the firepower of the members composing the assault force, so the main assault force, and all of the units are considered to be support units, and therefore they can only add half of their firepower. And there is a 18 factor limit for both sides, which I think is kind of interesting, kind of important, so you avoid having to do too much number crunching and going to some crazy results, some crazy totals as it happens in other games. You total the firepower that is brought to bear by both the attacker and the defender. You compute that in the form of combat odds by dividing the total firepower of the attacker by that of the defender, and so you will have, in so many other games, an odds ratio can be 2 to 1, no less than 1 to 3, can go up to quite a lot. Then you will apply modifiers, and of course modifiers, especially when they're built around such a simple, straightforward, traditional combat system, are pretty important because they are what gives depth and a lot of nuance to the design. So you can have air support if, of course, the weather conditions allow you to. You can have artillery support if you are able to use headquarters to bring artillery support. The headquarters are used for that, among other things. So artillery, for example, gives you shifts. Troop quality, a factor that I mentioned earlier, a factor that is on non-silhouetted units. In most games where you have troop quality modifiers, what happens is usually that the player with the best troop quality gets a column shift or gets some sort of otherwise benefits. In this game it's slightly non-symmetrical because the attacker does get a shift on the combat table of 1 column to his advantage if he has the best troop quality of the units involved in the fight. However, the defender does not receive a troop quality shift based on that, but does receive a column shift if all participating attacking units have a negative troop quality rating. Of course, only the ones in the main assault force. Artillery gives you column shifts, as I said, support coming from air forces, from air support also gives you bonuses. Tiger tanks give you a bonus, and of course armor also gives you a bonus. If you are the attacker and you have armor values and the opponent doesn't have any armor in the fight, then you get a bonus. If both sides have armor value in it, then the attacker needs to have a higher value than the defender to be able to get a bonus. Finally, once you have all of your bonuses and modifiers taken into account, you roll a die on the column that in the end you end up using for the fight, and the numeric and letter result that you find is the one that you apply to the situation. It may be that the defender loses half of his total steps and then needs to retreat by 4 hexes. That can be pretty devastating for the Germans that are both trying to survive and not to give up too much terrain. But of course also the Allies don't want to be pushed back all the way to the sea. A1, D1, then both sides lose steps. The attacker loses 1, defender loses 2, defender loses. Exchange, you know how it works in most war games, each side loses a step. And then similar penalties to the ones that you saw here, but that apply to the defender. So many results will also include a retreat, which may be by 4 hexes or by 2 hexes. However, as in other games by Simonich, there is the possibility of attempting a determined defense in case you really don't want to be pushed back, you really wanted to hold your position, even if at the risk of getting your troops hurt quite a bit in the process. So if you are mandated to retreat and you decide to try not to, then you roll on this table, choosing the column that depends on the terrain that you're using. Modifiers may apply, and then simply you will know whether the retreat is cancelled or not, and if it is cancelled, then also other effects may apply. For example, there may be a loss of steps for the defender on exchange, or it may also be actually that the attacker gets to lose some strength, but that is pretty difficult and pretty rare. And in case you want to have a complete list of the combat modifiers that apply in this game, then you can simply stop right there, pause the video, and you can read the table here, taking all the time that you want. So, after you resolve a fight, you have advanced after combat in case the defender vacated the defending hex. And very interesting, again, like it happens in some Simonich games, but not so much in other games, you do not necessarily have to enter the hex where the fight took place. You can exploit advance after combat just to gain momentum and to move in different directions, which can be particularly interesting and useful as it opens up a whole range of opportunities and possibilities to well, simply replace your units in useful places and locations right after combat. For example, placing them in a position that projects a zone of control against the opponent as you're thinking about where the opponent will be and will try to go next turn. You have, as in other D-Day games, special procedures for turn 1 to resolve the landing, so that comes with the theme. It's pretty standard. But more or less, these are the main concepts in the game. The game continues for a number of turns that will depend based on the length of the scenario that you have decided to play. The game may also end in an early victory for one of the sides. So for example, in case the LA player manages to have 3 or more units that are in supply on the eastern or southern edge of the map. In this case, the LA player has managed to open a full corridor across the map, and that is pretty bad for the German player, so the game in that case ends in an automatic and immediate Allied victory. The German player wins by closing 3 beachheads, or another way for the German player to win is to reduce or eliminate a sufficient number of Allied units that represents enough of a moral blow to the Allies to significantly slow down their operations. If neither player achieves automatic victory by the end of the last turn of the scenario, then victory is determined by counting victory points, which are based on occupation of specific important objectives on the map. Now, when you heard Simonich and 44, maybe something that came to mind was Ardennes 44, a very famous game by the same designer, by Simonich. And that is one of my favorite war games of all times. On the other hand, that is also a big mouthful to chew and to swallow. It is more complex than Normandy 44. It has large map, and it takes many hours to play. It is pretty much something of a monster, maybe not a mini monster, a mega monster, a medium monster game. Great satisfaction, great enjoyment from playing that one, but it's not something that you can set up and play in a single evening. Here we have a game with Normandy 44 that actually is playable, and to me playability is one of the key words here, because we have a design that is detailed enough to give you a pretty good sense of how things happen, how different sides had to face different challenges, and the types of challenges you have here are very specific, are very historically flavorful. You have the weather, you have the supplies, you have the lines of supplies, you have the beachheads, you have the assaults, you have the trade-off, especially for the Germans, between space and survival of units that may or may not get sacrificed as they're trying to push the Allies back. Of course, again, the Allies had the same problem. I don't know why somehow, as I was playing the game, the Germans felt more under pressure. maybe because they are the ones that historically lost the context, and they are the ones that in fact historically had to give way to the opponent, and they do seem to, and things seem to work that way. Seems that the ally player in the game has a certain momentum, and that allows the ally player to extend around. Actually, yeah, I found that the two sides in that sense, of course, how can I say it? I wouldn't say it's there's a little bit of scripting. It's just that the situation is such that the LA player has to push, and the German player has to hold and surround and try to break down enemy units, try to pocket them, but most likely the opposite will happen. The ally player has the interesting challenge, of course, of having to protect the beaches while also trying to move towards Cherbourg, while at the same time inflicting enough damage that then forming a long line along front will not constitute overstretching. You can form that if the opponent is weakened enough that you're not too afraid of a counterattack that can have devastating results. So I found the game to mirror the challenges that the two sides have to face quite well, and very important in terms that are, in ways that are interesting and exciting and entertaining gameplay-wise. The game plays well as a solitaire game because there is no hidden information, there is not huge randomness like you have, for example, in a cheat pool game, but you have the combat table, there's always some randomness there. You have the randomness due to weather, and so you have that aspect that you can surprise yourself as you're playing both sides, or say three sides if you want to see it that way, at the best of your possibilities and skills. Definitely playability in the sense that you have a game that feels detailed, has a good degree of historicity, or a list of historical challenges that are presented to you that you have to deal with. But at the same time, it is a single map. At the same time, it has a fairly low number of units involved. So that's very different from, say, for example, some of the monster games about Normandy. It's interesting to me that the Ardennes games that very often are more contained have been portrayed by Simonich in a sort of monster game, and this topic that so often has been monstered out actually is presented in a very manageable format. A single map, manageable. It doesn't feel like the game is logistically cumbersome. By logistics in this sense, I'm talking about the logistics of the player gameplay, not necessarily the logistic represented in the game, because those are pretty important, and you have to worry about the way that your units will occupy terrain and will open and occupy lines of communication so that they can stay supplied and can transport things, and you can keep your engineers on the beach so they're happy and they keep the communication open with the other side of the channel for the allies, of course. But logistically, it is a game that you don't have to wait for a big holiday before you finally put it on the table and you play. Definitely, it is a game that doesn't feel like a monster game. It's manageable, playable, and it's fun. It's interesting and exciting because you have all of these interesting elements that have been captured with such well-oiled mechanics. You can see how Simonich is using concepts that come from a long school of wargaming. There is a certain classic feel to the design, while at the same time there are a lot of these hallmarks of Simonich approach to things that give you that extra detail, that extra level of nuance that is, again, interesting to have. So you have more history, you have more detail, but at the same time doesn't become too cumbersome. It doesn't make the game too complex. I do not know that this is a beginner's war game. I would say probably not, because you still have an amount of rules and sub-rules, so that is there. That is something that you need to learn. And if you are a seasoned war gamer, it's not that you have a magic wand that, boom, the game pops in your head. It's just that some of those rules and concepts you know already, so you're gonna have to spend less time absorbing them. You're like, oh, okay, I know this. And even with some of those old things, or old traditional classic mechanics, classic ideas, there's still some innovative takes here that have been added to the design. So the design, I find it to be a convincing, pretty satisfactory mix of good and old, of old school with a fresh approach, and finally, in the end, a very good overall picture that comes out of this. It's the mechanics mechanics work well, the theme is definitely there, the game is fun and enjoyable to play. Definitely, it has to be one of the most playable games about Normandy that also has such good level of detail. Of course, they're a simpler game, but you're missing a lot when you're talking about this topic. And then you have much more complex games where you have more detail, but to the point that there's a baggage that comes with it that is a burden that not all wargamers are willing to the shoulder, and definitely not one that you can realistically carry very often. Some of those monster games are more exciting to think about and fantasize about than actually to play when it takes you weeks or months to complete. This is a game about Normandy that feels about Normandy, has enough history to feel specific and to present you with interesting challenges that derive from history, and at the same time, again, it is manageable and playable. And to me, that's quite a good thing. Normandy 44, second edition. I have no idea how the first one was, but I have to tell you, the second one I like very much.